Good afternoon, I'm Paul and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to the University of Auckland 2022 3-minute thesis presentation. This is a celebration of some of our finest young minds applying their knowledge and skill in real life. The following talks address a wide range of fascinating topics and very relevant topics, including things faraway places like Kabul, big data and how it can be used and to help with better design, and mental health and how we can inform and improve treatments. Today we're going to hear from Sam and Rachel and Joseph, three of our leading postgraduate and PhD students. And we have plenty of time for questions, so please do use the chat function and the question and answer function that's on your screen in the Zoom. We'll be collecting those questions. You can rank them, and I hope to get to all of them during the course of this presentation. So the format for today's event is that each of the speakers will make their 3-minute presentation, followed by a few minutes of question and answers. We'll then repeat the same format for each of the speakers and then hopefully have a few minutes to wrap up the remaining questions at the end of the session. Our aim is to have you finished by 10 minutes to 5. Let's get straight into these excellent talks. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Sam Mackay from the Faculty of Business and Economics, and he's going to ask us to consider expatriate work and wellbeing in Kabul, Afghanistan.
Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. WTF in the NATO alphabet. The title of a Hollywood movie starring Tina Fey. And something akin to what I uttered when I found myself in a bomb blast in Kabul, Afghanistan, just 2 years ago. As I huddled in the bunker, the force of the explosion having ripped through the compound, tearing tiles from the ceiling, shattering glass windows, and leaving blood splattered across the ground. 2 questions popped into my head. 1, what on earth are you doing here? And 2, when something like this happens, how do you cope? Working in conflict zones is risky business and has profound implications for international human resource management. To keep staff safe, organisations like the United Nations and NGOs have hidden staff behind fortified walls in compounds like the one you see behind me. Although designed with good intentions, these environments can have negative impacts because essentially they're prisons where staff have to live, work and play 24/7. And that has huge ramifications for how people work and how people cope. Now, while I was there, I saw people cope in 4 key ways: by drinking, by hiding away in their rooms, by working out, or by eating. In other words, by being a drunk, a monk, a hunk, or a chunk. In my research, I'm interviewing expatriates in Kabul's compounds to better understand their experiences and to identify strategies to improve their well-being. As well as its practical relevance, this research aims to address a gap in the literature relating to the management of people in such contexts and to contribute to debates regarding the sustainability of interventions in aid and development. Now, it's too soon for results, but what my initial interviewees have spoken about has been striking. They're struggling with the blurring between work and non-work because essentially they're living at work. They're finding it challenging working with their colleagues who know absolutely everything about their personal lives. And they've identified simple strategies to improve well-being because when you're operating in the extreme, the essential quickly becomes clear. The Taliban are on the march in Afghanistan, and recent projections suggest that the government will fall within months. Despite this, international organisations are planning to retain a presence there, perhaps involving harsher conditions for staff. Compounds like this aren't going to go away, so it requires us to better understand the implications of placing staff within them. So the next time someone has to utter Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, they and we will know exactly what to do next.
Thanks so much, Sam. Obviously, fast-moving events, and as we know, since you first recorded that speech, there's been enormous change across the world with the events in the Ukraine. Just to start off the questions, and I'd encourage people, please do enter your questions if you have any into the Q&A, but just to get things started, what's been the impact of the fall of Kabul and on your research in particular since that happened?
Oh, well, kia ora, Paul, and kia ora koutou to everyone at the University of Auckland Society. Thanks for having me here today. Yeah, as you mentioned, Paul, really dramatic events. I think I recorded that 3-minute thesis recording, and it was only a few weeks before Kabul actually fell. So at that point, projections were suggesting it was going to take months, and in fact, it took days, if not weeks, if not days. So it was really quite striking. Personally, for me, it was really heartbreaking to see all those scenes. I'd spent 18 months working in Afghanistan trying to improve the education system there. And it was quite heartbreaking to see all that work kind of fall to the side and with the Taliban taking back over. Most importantly for my research, most relevant to my research, that was my peak interviewing time. That meant all my participants were basically out of action. So I couldn't actually reach out to them and interview them because they were too busy either trying to get out of Afghanistan or were working on this mission to help other people get out. So it really delayed everything there. But I've managed to pick up those interviews this year. But a lot of people expected internationals to leave Kabul. What we've found is that a number of international organisations have increased their staff footprint there, and conditions are much, much harder there than it was when I was there.
Okay, and a question from the audience: have you seen any results from your research since you won this award? What are you doing in terms of the sort of activation of your research findings?
Yeah, good question. I'm actually still in the field research component. So I'm hopefully wrapping up my interviews the next week or two, trying to get the last interviews across the line. It's been really difficult to try and nail those interviews down, what with the events around the fall of Kabul. And just recently with Ukraine, I had 3 research participants who had to pull out because obviously their focus needed to be on that. So I am not yet at the results stage. That's going to come later this year. So a lot of work ahead for me yet.
Excellent. And just finally, these interviews have covered some very sensitive topics, in terms of how you approached your interviewing and your participants. A lot of ethical considerations there. Couldn't be more relevant, really. None of us could have foreseen the events in the Ukraine. So what are the considerations that you brought to bear with the work that you were doing from an ethical perspective?
Yeah, really good question, Paul. So obviously, as you mentioned, really sensitive issues that I cover with my research participants. They're very sharing of their personal lives, themes popping up around mental health, PTSD, sexual harassment, toxic bosses, overuse of alcohol and drugs and the like. So really heavy topics. Lots of approaches that I needed to put in place around ethics. But I guess one of the key points that I'd make was, in fact, it was the consideration of Māori research principles when it came to ethics that most shaped my approach. So it was really consideration of participant mana and manaakitanga, which made me reconsider how I was going to approach those interviews and make sure that I was meeting participants where they are at, as opposed to taking, I guess, like a forensic investigator or a Tova O'Brien approach, perhaps, where I was trying to really extract a lot of information from people who are, in quite sensitive situations. So I was concerned that approach may mean that I didn't get as much information for my research. In reality, it's actually been the opposite. So people have been extremely forthcoming with their lives, and many have remarked that they've been surprised at how much they've actually shared because they weren't intending to. So that's just one example of a really good approach, really good outcome from applying Māori research principles around ethics.
Really nice to hear the international relevance of that relationship-based approach, and thank you very much. So all of you out there, please do add any further questions you might have for Sam, because we can look back near the end of this presentation. Thank you, Sam, and all of you out there who are attending this event. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Rachel Lawson, who is from the Faculty of Science and is our second speaker this afternoon. She's going to share her extraordinary insights into human movement patterns in our communities as we all learn to live with COVID. Over to you, Rachel.
This is a COVID-19 announcement. At 11:59 tonight, Auckland is entering Alert Level 4 lockdown again. Gyms, malls, schools, and non-essential services will shut. Travel out of Auckland is restricted. You have 5 hours before lockdown begins. So how do you react? Where do you go? According to media reports, many of you and your phones will rush to the supermarkets, panic buying toilet paper, while others will self-evacuate to batches across the borders. But were these reports actually true? Where were we moving during lockdowns? And did Aucklanders adhere to health advice to remain in our local neighbourhoods? Normally, mobility is predictable, with routines in the places we visit, the people we interact with, and the ways we commute. But COVID changed this. Historically, researchers used time-consuming travel surveys and interviews with small sample sizes. But there's now an abundance of data available from your mobile phone locations. Every day, advertisements within apps like Facebook, Uber, Tinder, and Google Maps track your locations, selling GPS coordinates to researchers like me. These apps running in the background provide a near continuous record of your personal movement. I'm using machine learning on millions of phone locations, finding trips to users' homes, workplaces, and destinations like supermarkets. I'm testing the significance of changes to the distance, frequency, and types of trips before and during lockdowns. And while I've only just started, my method is showing potential on test data. On the left is messy, raw data. This square, the size of Albert Park, contains over 5,500 data points from more than 500 mobile phones. And on the right, after analysis, is a 2-hour-long GPS track from one anonymous phone user who was walking between bars late at night. So why does this matter? This sounds creepy. I'm using privacy-protecting methods to gain insights and visualise our movement through cities, seeing if COVID magnified social inequalities between different neighbourhood and demographic groups. And thankfully, my lockdown scenario tonight is fake, but these data points and mobile phone locations are real. You could all be one of my data points. So thanks for participating in my research.
Thanks, Rachel. Obviously, a lot of water under the bridge since you recorded that a few months back. Just to kick things off, can you give us a sense about the complete sample size of your data for the complete project? Because obviously you were only just starting out at that point.
Yeah, so when I did this 3-minute thesis, I was about 6 months into my 1-year master's. So I hadn't started using real New Zealand and Auckland data. So instead of the 500 phones and 5,000 data points, it ended up being 20,000 phones and 89 million rows of locations. So if you think about a normal Excel spreadsheet, each line is a different row. I had 89 million of those, which were individual points that someone had their phone ping. So it's quite a lot bigger, and it could have been even bigger. I just ran out of time.
Mind-boggling amounts of data. In fact, there's a question coming from the audience asking just how much data is being collected in Auckland City. I don't even know how you begin to quantify that.
Well, for the larger sample size that we had, so obviously I constrained it to do a 12-month master's, was 1.5 million phones and many hundreds of millions of rows of data.
Okay, excellent. John Goldsmith's come online and asked the question we're all begging to ask you, which is, have you had any early results which you can share with us?
I have my final results now. I luckily submitted my thesis at the end of February. So one of the big things we looked at is how many places we visited. Because obviously if everything's shut, where can you go? You can still go to the supermarket, medical appointments in your house. But before lockdown, we'd go to about 11 places in a week. During level 4, we went to 3 places on average in my small sample size of 20,000. And then during level 3, when we had slightly less restrictions, so if you remember, we could have takeaways and click and collect, important things, we went to about 4 places. So you can see the pattern in my graph started really nice and high, massive drop, and then slowly recovered. Further into like level 2, we kept recovering as more shops opened. Things like distance changed massively. there was a 93% reduction in the distance that we travelled over a 1 week period, which makes sense if you're not commuting to work. And even the size of our neighbourhood where we would visit changed. So instead of being a nice big circle with lots of locations dispersed through the city, it was nice and small, often kind of a rectangle of just one to the supermarket and back home.
Very interesting. So a question's come through asking about the potential applications, particularly what agencies you intuitively think might be most interested in your findings.
Yeah, so since I've finished, I've actually moved into a Crown Research Institute who are looking at how can we use mobile phone data potentially in the future. So different research organisations like universities, GNS Science, which is where I now work, so looking at natural hazards, how might this impact how we evacuate, can we track people? There's lots of opportunities and lots of organisations already use mobile phone data to an extent, like Stats New Zealand, lots of places.
Excellent. What are some of the most interesting and significant changes you noticed as you interpreted the data that you collected?
So one that I thought was quite interesting, I wanted to see how it changed from different neighbourhoods and also like deprivation, how people who might have more access to goods and services might be impacted. So before lockdown, just in normal conditions, no restrictions, phones that were based in less deprived neighbourhoods, so generally more wealthy, more accessible, had larger and more mobility in general, more places, more distance, large neighbourhoods. But during lockdown, it flipped completely. So phones that were based in high deprivation areas were moving a lot more. So this might mean that we have kind of a clustering of essential workers who would have to continue to move through the city during lockdown, which kind of impacts how we might plan for future, well, at the time, how we might have planned for future lockdowns.
Indeed, but has health and transport implications as well. Yeah. Interesting. What significant changes would you think have occurred with people's movement now that COVID is actually out in our community?
So I had a look a little bit further into kind of late 2021 data, not for mobile phone, but for kind of transportation, for example, for the buses. And we have slowly recovered, but we haven't actually reached normal peak conditions. So even when there was no community transmission, the bus rates still did not reach back to normal conditions. Lots of reasons. People might not trust it. Everyone's loving to an extent working from home. So our transport moves and we might be visiting less places. You know, everyone's not going on everyone's changing to domestic transport and travel rather than international with the borders changed. So there's lots of widespread change. Yeah.
A question from the audience this afternoon. Could you ever have imagined we would have such a great pool of data that you could use for this sort of research?
No, I got very lucky. My supervisor paid a pretty penny for a data set and I was able to access a small chunk of it for this work. It's not generally publicly available because there's lots of ethical constraints. So it was pretty awesome to be able to use such a large data set and be able to go in such detail as well.
Delighted to hear that you are actually applying that your findings and your research in real life. I'd encourage our attendees today, if you've got any further questions for Rachel, please do drop them into the Q&A. Thank you, Rachel, that's awesome. And also to all of you who have been asking such great questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce Joseph from the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences, who's our final speaker today. And he will share his research and findings on innovative treatment to improve our mental health, with a special focus on coping with depression. Over to you, Joseph.
Imagine this. You feel dejected and worthless. You're always tired, but also panicked. It's gotten to the point where you're just numb. You search up the electronic interweb for what's wrong with you because you now have feelings that you wish you didn't exist anymore. You fill out an online questionnaire, and it tells you may have something called severe depression. You dismiss that report though. You're privileged, you have so much. Other people have it worse than you. Google tells you to see a doctor, but you put it off for weeks and months. Your friends, family, colleagues, they all begin to notice something off with you. Meanwhile, your favorite line to them is, "Oh, I'm just tired, that's all." You make it to the doctor's somehow. The doctor gives you a questionnaire to fill out. Turns out that questionnaire was the same one you did all those months ago. And your doctor suggests maybe you should start taking these antidepressant drugs. Which one? It's just trial and error. Just flip a coin, pick that one. Oh, and you may feel side effects like nausea, insomnia, increased fatigue, and because you're under 25, you may also feel increased suicidal ideation. All of that for a few weeks before you have a chance of feeling better. The doctor ushers you out and tells you to book another appointment in a month's time. You chuckle as you swipe your card to pay for an appointment you can't afford and to go pick up your prescription with your lunch money. At least one of the drug's side effects is weight gain. You're back at your doctor's after a month. Still feeling the same awful, but at least you're feeling nausea and fatigue. The doctor suggests maybe you should try another drug. Which one? I don't know, flip a coin. You shrug and you give it another try, wondering what the point is. This experience that I've just outlined has happened to millions of people around the world. Depression affects over 300 million people globally, and current treatments only tend to work in several weeks. And don't forget, they feel worse before you might feel better. But what if you go to your doctors, but they decide to run a brain scan, and the results from that brain scan show your medial prefrontal cortex and your posterior cingulate cortex is hyperactively connected, like shown. And because of that, your brain is predisposed to rumination, excessive rumination. And because you have this subtype of depression, this biomarker, it means you have the best chance of recovery using this particular therapy. And this therapy, it takes a few days to work rather than several weeks. My clinical trial, where we image the brains of 40 depressed people, I give them a drug called scopolamine, and I watch them get better within the next few days. That's what my research is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Very interesting to understand the maturing aspects of our medical and health sciences disciplines in terms of tailored treatment for specific cohorts. Can you give us an update, please, in terms of where you've got to since you recorded that session?
Yeah, of course. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for having me here. Yeah, so since I gave that talk, I've now completed my clinical trial, and we've given all 40 people the drug called scopolamine, and we've evaluated sort of how it worked for a lot of these depressed individuals. We found that specifically in this clinical trial that a lot of people actually did start to feel better within a few days, within 3 days on average. However, it didn't actually improve. So in our clinical trial, we had to compare it to a placebo, and we used an active placebo to better blind the results. And we found that actually people in both groups actually got better quite significantly. However, that said, because both groups equally got significantly better in terms of depressive mood, depressive symptoms, it also meant that statistically it didn't mean that there was actually difference between it, and so therefore we had to declare a failed trial. But that, because we actually did a lot of other neuroimaging and electrocardiography, it actually revealed some interesting results that we're still working through at the moment. We found that for example, heart rate variability, what that sort of shows is how relaxed your body sort of is. And so we found depressed people usually have slightly increased tension, which is normal, which is expected, and also therefore lower heart rate variability. And therefore this drug actually decreases heart rate variability and increases heart rate variability. So it shows that there are actually other mechanisms by which we might be able to find have an antidepressant effect. So yeah, it's been quite an interesting journey. We're looking through the results sort of now, and
can I ask what your next steps are with your research in terms of your intentions and the path from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to look more carefully at the we need to look carefully more at the neuroimaging, at what aspects of the brain actually changes. So, for example, when, as I alluded to in the talk, if you think you're depressed, you often go to the doctor and you just sort of fill out a form, and that's sort of it. That kind of diagnoses you with depression, obviously also with a consultation. However, we'd also like to know what a depressed brain looks like, and that's what you would have seen in my slide as well. So we want to look for things called biomarkers for depression, and that way we might be able to use these tools and also to be able to find newer treatments for depression.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Someone's asked a question. They've obviously highlighted the alarming issue that's hidden. Often, it's not until quite recently that things such as this have been talked about so openly. What sort of response have you had, if any, from agencies who work in this area?
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of people are it's very difficult for people, agencies in this area, because they've got a lot of people. I don't work directly with primary health as my research is largely sort of from community, just self-referral. We advertise generally to the wider public, so that would be less relevant. I won't be able to comment on that.
Okay, could I, with Hillary's wants to know if you selected the subjects with a specific type of depression?
Yeah, so depression currently has only a few demarcations. We selected people specifically with major depressive disorder, otherwise known as unipolar depression. So we didn't select people with bipolar depression, postpartum depression. But I guess that sort of highlights the point. 300 million people around the world with something we call major depressive disorder, and yet we can't even divide it into different buckets. And so that's what we really do need to try and find. For example, if I said you had heart disease, we can image it in so many ways: X-ray, CT, ECG. We can actually find out what sort of heart disease you may have. And so similarly with depression, that's also what we'd like to do. We'd like to say, oh, you have this type of depression, that type of depression. And once we have that, then we can find better treatments for those specific different types of depression.
Okay. A question from the audience. I think quite a few people out there might have had their youth during the 60s and 70s, because they're suggesting there is increased evidence of the use of psychedelic substances for mental health. Does this suggest other uses of brain imaging to predict response to alternative medications?
Yeah, psychedelics, fascinating area of research. The psychedelics, as you may know, it was actually LSD, for example. LSD was actually developed for the purposes of, it was identified incidentally, and then later was used for psychiatric purposes, but then it was just clamped down sort of unilaterally on Nixon's war on drugs. And yet, actually, recently, there's been a lot of research into saying, actually, these psychedelics, they really work amazingly well. However, we should also mention that we have to be careful in modern clinical research and methodologies. We also need to be careful about placebo effects. And is this all due to placebo effect, or is this not? Is this to do with the biological effect manifested in the brain? And so therefore we need to be careful as to what specifically do psychedelics do, or what specifically does my drug scopolamine do? What does it biophysiologically do in order to alter the brain? And therefore, by understanding the biology of it, then we may be able to find the targeted treatments that specifically target this correct pathway in order to improve well-being altogether.
Okay, really interesting to hear your take on that. And I think there's a related subsequent question here, which is a tricky one, but it's such an important one in human relations to measure. The question is, how do you think your clinical trial outcome was influenced by people feeling that they were being cared about?
Absolutely, fantastic question. We absolutely acknowledge that a lot of these people, depressed people, we actually had to contact them at day 1, day 3, 1 week, 2 week, 4 week. We had to contact them frequently to say, hey, how are you doing? And of course, that in and of itself has been shown in past research to have a therapeutic effect. And so that's why we have that we have that active placebo group to also see if that also does anything. I will note that my clinical population was actually psychiatrically they call them less depressed, in the sense that they haven't engaged in as much therapy, and so this cohort of patients are more susceptible to placebo effects, and so therefore, yes, that is something that definitely could be a covariate, and it's one of the limitations of our study. But that said, if someone's on average, our cohort of clinical patients actually improved dramatically, and so with or without this placebo effect, it still is a massive effect. And so biologically in the brain, we might be able to identify actually, well, what is it that can invoke this sort of thing. So in a way, I guess, there's external factors such as being talking with someone constantly, but there's also these biological factors that sort of mediate the downstream effect of
Brilliant.
Our social interactions.
Thanks, Joseph. Anyone else has further questions for Joseph, please drop them into the Q&A. And we're just going to have the other speakers come back and join us. Hi, Rachel. Hi, Sam. Welcome back. And thanks to all of you out there for the ongoing questions. Sam, I've got another one that we just want to pick up, if we may, with you in terms of reflections on the horrific attack in the Ukraine. And any thoughts or learnings you may have gleaned from your experience in Kabul and your work for us to think about and reflect on, given what's happening there.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think like everyone, I've been watching the imagery over there with just horror and shock that in this day and age, someone, yet another dictator decides to destroy another country. It's pretty awful. In terms of my specific research context, it's very difficult to draw parallels to the Ukraine. But I guess more broadly, what I'm very concerned about is kind of the mental health impacts that many Ukrainians will be facing as a result of this military intervention. So, I'm really concerned about things like mental health and PTSD and the like, both for the Ukrainians who fight, for the elderly who can't leave and flee, for the families who do flee, even to the impacts that will be had for the pets that stay behind as well. I mean, it's just a huge humanitarian disaster I'm really concerned about, as I think we all are. So yeah, I'm hoping there's going to be an end to this sometime soon.
Yeah, it's interesting as we reflect on this, the role of universities and students such as you to quarry for insights and then disseminate your research widely has never been more important. The questioning of facts, the questioning of science. Yeah, Rachel, I'm interested to hear your thoughts in terms of biggest surprises from your research. Was there anything that really stood out for you?
I think it would be the difference in the fact that there was a statistically significant difference between different deprivation areas. It's something that we had heard of, and anecdotally people said, certain neighbourhoods like South Auckland have higher essential workers, but to be able to actually put it on a map and say these people did actually move more, it doesn't necessarily mean they had lower compliance, as the media was trying to suggest. But it just showed, it was cool being able to see it on a map.
Yeah, interesting. There's a sort of follow-up question come through there in terms of how the pandemic has affected your research and studies, because I, like many other thousands of people around the country, have had COVID and almost recovered from it. Interesting that you've noted that disparity, because I think all of us felt for the people that were in those frontline roles, even the people in the supermarket stacking the shelves, because it's probably the last place on earth they wanted to be, risking their lives and their health and their families doing those frontline jobs. Yeah,
it's very much a privilege to be able to actually work from home and to be able to not move. Yeah.
Interesting and powerful statement. Joseph, there's a question here about the fact that your trial didn't work, but what would you do differently if you were starting again? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so actually we did the trial. We had an active placebo group, so we actually gave people a drug that was actually very similar to scopolamine, except that it doesn't cross into the brain. So that was an active placebo, so people would have actually felt, I did receive something, but they wouldn't know whether it was the active drug or the placebo. Now, what however, in past research, what they did was just they delivered saline into people, so you can kind of figure out if you've got saline because nothing happens. And so, however, given what we found in the placebo effect, we might also have liked to also include an arm where we just gave people saline as well, just to improve comparability in experimental design. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, good. And I'm sure further ideas will develop. Sam, I'm interested to answer the question here about whether you observed any differences in experience based on gender and or time spent in a combat zone.
Absolutely, great question. Absolutely. What I've, and it's one of the, I guess, surprises, not a great surprise, but, you know, something that I wasn't expecting to come through so strongly with my interviews, but it is that every single female research participant I've interviewed has, without being prompted, raised issues of sexual harassment and quite serious issues around that as well. So, you know, living in these compounds, you know, looked after by your employer, they are supposed to be safe spaces, but every single one of them has said that they felt very uncomfortable in certain social environments, such as, you know, the social club, which is the main area in the compound where you go for meals and for drinks and for just recreation time. And people have noted the concern that they have when their colleagues know where they live. So on the compound, you know absolutely where everyone lives, you know, which container people live in. And there are a number of participants who have said, you know, people have entered their home, basically, their room, not, you know, and they've had to fight people off. One other really heartbreaking story, which one of my participants mentioned, was that when she, you know, went on a daily walk around the compound for exercise, she actually made decisions as to where in the compound she would go. And it's not a huge compound, based on the individuals who were in particular locations, because she was so concerned about her safety. So yeah, really, really quite terrible, and particularly terrible because every single female participant who I've interviewed has raised issues along those lines. So it's really quite concerning.
Layering stress upon stress. Rachel, can I ask you in the first instance whether the whole stress of having to remember, goodness me, total respect for all three of you, a 3-minute thesis speech, has that helped you at all with your communication of your work and how you can convey and help others understand what you're working on?
I think it was actually, yeah, I think it did. I already had a little bit of speaking experience kind of by force because I got a job working as an outreach coordinator and had to learn very quickly to speak to large groups of people, but I'd never spoke to more than about 50. So having the Vice Chancellor sitting right in front of me with 250 people in a lecture theatre definitely gave me a bit of confidence to give it a go. And I actually think it contributed to me getting my current job because they had seen the video, and so it worked out quite well. I'm definitely more confident now than I was.
Very pleased to hear that, because most people fear death more than public speaking. I mean, less than public speaking. It's quite a scary thing, right? Joseph, I've got a specific question here around the controversies around the use of, is that DSM-5? I'm not sure what that is. Maybe you could explain that to us as a classification of mental health conditions. The question is, how likely is your research to become universally acceptable as part of the diagnostic process?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, first of all, the DSM-5 is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Diagnoses. So it's all about diagnosing according to this sort of thing. Yeah, in order to diagnose someone with depression, you have to check off like, oh, they have at least had anhedonia and something else for 2 weeks, plus a whole raft of other things. First of all, yeah, it's been tried for a long time to try and improve the diagnostic process, and we've tried to better understand different ways to biologically diagnose as well, not to great success. And so, but the thing is, we've moved ahead across 20 years already. Like people have been doing since well before, actually more than 20 years. However, now with the advent of machine learning, it's also possible that we may be able to improve other senses. also improve other biosignatures to improve the diagnoses of these. As to whether it's likely to become universally acceptable, I still feel this is very far off because we just don't know how the brain works. There's just too many unknowns as to that. Regarding scopolamine and hallucinogenic, we gave the dosage we delivered at was much lower than very low, was much lower than if one were to have hallucinogenic responses to it. Yeah, and I think I spotted another question where it was like whether we actually scan it at the end. We didn't actually scan at the end of the trial, so we unfortunately don't have that data. So yeah, to summarize, yes, it's definitely I'd like my research to contribute eventually to helping the diagnostic process. So I think it also is validating for someone who might think, no, I don't have depression. But then I can, if we scan their brain and we can actually tell them, no, actually this part of the brain is like this or whatever, that actually can be quite a validating experience and actually benefit, to some people it may be quite beneficial to know that. Yeah.
Would you? It seems to me as a sort of, okay, we're all associated with the University of Auckland and all aware of the Brain Centre and Richard Fall's amazing work there, pioneering and leading. Would you say it's fair to say that a lot of the stigma has at least been reduced and that this is an area that's getting adequate focus as a research area now? Is that, have you seen a change in that?
So yes and no. It's fantastic that there's been much greater talk about mental health in general. However, I think right now we do need more funding for mental health research. If you look at the number of, so there's something called disability adjusted life years. Mental health still ranks one of the lowest because there are a lot of influencers that seem to think if you go for a run that will cure your mental health issues. So I don't want to negate any of the information sharing. It's great to be talking about mental health and having the correro around it. However, I still think that we need to better understand what exactly is going wrong biologically in the brain, and therefore we can better treat it. Much like how if you have a heart disease, we need to know what exactly is wrong with the heart, and therefore we can treat it. It's not enough to just say, if you have a heart disease, go for a run. That will solve everything. It probably will, but not for everyone. Not for everyone.
Okay. Sam, any final comments from you as we sort of getting close to using our allocated time?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone at the University of Auckland Society for your support and sponsorship of the university's 3-minute thesis competition. It's really amazing to have that support. This was the first year I participated in it, and what I think was the best aspect of it for me was actually hearing so many amazing people do such amazing research and actually share some of that in a way that I could actually understand from different fields. So it's a really amazing event. So if you do get a chance to go to it later this year, I definitely encourage you to. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for your support.
Excellent. It's really great to see the cross-pollination and interdisciplinary activity that is sparked by things like the thesis competition. I think it's excellent. My own son is attending the University of Auckland doing global studies, and it took him a long time to explain to me that it wasn't a traditional faculty-based degree. I kept saying, well, so what is it? Is it a BSc? Is it a BA? And he said, no, Dad, it's global studies. We do all sorts of different stuff. So quite fun to see the three of you here today from very different disciplines making a difference. Rachel, any closing comments from you?
Yeah, I just want to quickly say thank you as well. Some of you in the audience might donate to university scholarship funds. I've been very fortunate to receive postgraduate funding, which made completing a master's possible. I wouldn't have done it without funding. And so thank you for any contributions you made, and to Market Economics Limited as well, the company that provided me additional funding throughout the year. Awesome.
Joseph, the same for you. Any final remarks?
Yeah, I just want to say absolutely a massive thank you to the Society. I'm funded by the University of Auckland Doctoral Scholarship, and I'm sure that would definitely not be possible without the generous donation. And it really gives me the stability to actually proceed with the PhD. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and also for supporting the 3-minute thesis. I have to second absolutely what my colleagues have said. The 3-minute thesis, fantastic opportunity to spread our research. And to answer the previous question, yeah, the 3-minute thesis absolutely improved my confidence in public speaking. And as you rightfully said, Paul, a lot of people would prefer death to public or something. I second that notion.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. Also, a note to everybody who's attended, the session has been recorded, and a link to the presentations and the Q&A session will be sent to all society members and made available on the website. So please do share that with others. I'd like to thank you, Joseph, Rachel, Sam, and all of you out there for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And also thank you to the excellent technical team and the alumni relations team for all their help bringing this together. I think that's a nice sort of space for us to close. Well done to the three of you. We wish you all the very best with your careers and the application of your learnings in the real world. Ka kite anō, and goodbye all.